Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to get started quilting the Zinnia patch quilt, finally. So we're going to start by basting all 3 layers together. I baste my quilts on a large table. If you don't have a table to baste on, you can baste on the floor. It's just a lot easier on your back when you're able to baste on a table. But that's not a possibility for a lot of people. So I start by laying out my backing, securing it at several points with clamps. I'm using construction clamps. I know that's a bit overkill, but they work for me. I quilt every day, all day, so I didn't decide to go with the larger clamps because they do hold everything really securely, especially on large king and queen size quilts. So I'm just now getting the batting stretched out over the backing and getting it nice and smooth. Then next we'll do the quilt top. Now the downside to basting on a table and not on the floor, you do have to do it section by section, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. When you are basting on the floor, you can have the whole quilt laid out nice and smooth and secured all around the perimeter. That's not the case when you do it on a table, but it still works really well for me. So you may have to just try several different ways, experiment and see what works best for you in your sewing space. So now I have the top secured. I'm just going over, smoothing with my hand, make sure there are lumps or wrinkles, and just get it as smooth as you can. You do want to pull the back end batting pretty tight when you are securing it, but you don't want to stretch the fabric too much. If you stretch the fabric too much, then you're going to run into some weird things when you start actually quilting your quilt. It could kind of like spring back and bunch up a little bit. So you want it smooth and tight, but not stretched to the point where it's going to have some kind of spring back when you let those clamps off. And now we're just going to start pinning it. And if you are doing this on the floor, I would suggest starting in the very middle of the quilt and pinning outward. Because I'm doing it on a table, I just start from the top and work my way down. And I continue to just smooth it as I go to make sure that I'm not getting anything bunched up, especially with the backing. And I just use large safety pins because I am doing this on my dining room table. I put cutting mats underneath all 3 layers, keeps me from scratching up the table. And so you just work your way along, pinning every few inches. I mean, just use your own judgment here. I pin every maybe 3 or 4 inches, but use your own judgment and do what works best for you. So now we're moving on to the other half. And we'll just do the same thing over again. Just make sure to smooth all of your layers out as you go. And I forgot to mention I was using a hair marker and my ruler to mark my quilting lines before. And you can see my quilting lines here. I did not get any footage of me quilting. I just did straight line quilting. And now I'm going back and burying my threads. And I just use a piece of thread doubled over, and I make, thread it through, leave a loop, and then you're going to bring your thread through that loop, pull your needle through, and then just pop that knot that you tied in your ends through the top layer and the batting, and then clip your ends, and that's how you bury threads once you're done quilting. Now we are going to move on to binding. So I am taking all of my binding strips now and sewing them all together. You're going to follow the pattern here, and there's a description in there about how you orient your strips, and you can see how I did it here. Just one vertical, one horizontal, lay the vertical piece on top of the horizontal piece, and then you're going to sew diagonally from left corner down to the right corner. Then you're going to trim off the excess, and that will give you a nice long strip. And you just do this with all of your strips of binding, and then you will press that, take that to the ironing board, press it in half, and now we're going to sew it on to our quilt. I sew my binding on the top of the quilt. I just line up my raw edges. You've got that binding pressed in half, lay that on top, line up your raw edges, and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just sew along. When you come to a corner, I'm going to do a nice mitered corner, and the way I do that, I pinch my binding strip so that you've got just a little triangle sticking up, and just fold that over. You're going to, it's hard to see here, but I've got just pinched that up into a triangle. There you go. You can see it a little bit better now. And just holding it, just pinch it up, hold it in place. You can put a pin here if it's easier for you. I have just gotten away from using pins. And then you're going to fold that back towards you, and then sew right up until about a 1/4 inch from that other edge. Then you're going to keep your needle down, raise your foot, turn it, 1/4 turn, and slowly stitch down and back stitch about a 1/4 inch just to secure that corner. Now we're going to rotate the quilt. I'm going to do the other side. And this time you're going to start from the raw edge. You're going to fold that little triangle away from you now. So you have that triangle folded up and away. And then you're going to start from the raw edge and just start your 1/4 inch seam. And I backstitch a little bit right here. Then you're just going to continue on. You're going to do this to all 4 corners. And then next I'll show you how to join your ends. We're just going to continue sewing along. Okay, now we've reached the end, and I leave quite a bit of space there because you need a little bit of room to work. And so what I do, I take where the end where I started, join it up with my end where I stopped. And you're going to pinch that, and this is how I do it. If there is another way that works better for you, by all means, please do what's easiest for you. This is just what I've done over the years, and it works. So I pinch that, and I get it pretty secure. I mean, pretty, you don't want that quilt to be bunching up underneath, but you do want it pretty tight. And then I finger press right where those 2 pieces come together, and you want that right in the middle of that space. Finger press both pieces over. And then you're just going to line up those lines. You'll have a cross mark on each piece, and you just line up that center cross mark where you finger pressed and where your original pressing is for that binding. And then I just pin that in place. Honestly, sometimes I pin it, sometimes I don't. But if this is your first try, you will save yourself a lot of frustration if you just go ahead and pin that. And honestly, I probably should every time. It is easier. So just pin that, and then you're going to make a seam just like you did when you were joining all of your binding pieces in the beginning. You're just going to sew diagonally from the left side to the right, from the left corner to the right corner, if that makes sense. Just make sure to backstitch there. Take your pins out as you go. And make sure to backstitch. Okay, now your binding pieces are joined. And at this point, before you trim, make sure that it's laying nice and smooth, that the quilt isn't bunching up under it. You don't want to pucker there when you make a seam. And it is okay for me, so I'm going to go ahead and trim off the excess and just leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance there. Now at this point, you can take it and press it. I don't, honestly, just because it's just as easy to finger press it at this point. It's not going anywhere. You just want to make sure it's nice and clean, and that foot will kind of press it down a little bit. But if you're worried about it, go ahead and take it over to the ironing board and just press that seam down. And now we're going to start back where we stopped our stitching and just continue that 1/4 inch seam allowance and stitch down to where you started. And now your binding is attached to the front side. Now we're just going to fold it over and stitch it to the back. Now at this point, if you haven't done this before, you may want to practice with a scrap piece. You just want to find out where you're stitching. You want to be able to stitch as close to that folded edge as you can to keep it looking nice on the front and to keep it from going into the binding on the front. Now we're going to work on the mitered corner. So as you can see how we folded it on the front, when you fold that around to the back, it leaves a nice, clean, sharp corner. Now we're going to fold the piece you're working on towards you and then fold the horizontal piece up over that to create another mitered corner on the back, as you can see I've done here. Then you're going to carefully just sew down to that corner. Let your needle catch the piece that's folded up. Catch it once with maybe 1 or 2 stitches. Then you're going to back stitch once, stitch again forward, raise your foot, leave your needle in, rotate your quilt, 1/4 turn, put your foot down, stitch once, back stitch once, and then continue on sewing. And that gives you a nice, clean corner. And you just do this to all 4 corners. And then you continue on stitching until you reach the end, and just do a back stitch when you reach the end. But you can see the mitered corner here. It looks almost identical on the front and the back. And you just achieve that by, when you're sewing the binding on the front, pinching it up, then folding it around to the back and overlapping those edges. Okay guys, thanks for joining me, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I hope to have more videos to come. Thanks!